Good afternoon, everyone. So glad you could join us. And is it morning on the West Coast? I think it's afternoon on the West Coast as well. Maybe. I don't know. It's the nature of the pandemic. Thank you for joining us today. We are here for our panel on ensuring that student voice is present in federal policy making. We know that young people are the people directly impacted by our policies, right? They are the ones having lived experiences in schoolhouses every day, whether it be from early child care to K-12 education to higher education and other post-secondary opportunities. So it's critical that the people who are directly impacted not only get to advise on policy, but they have a seat at the table. Today, we have an amazing group of guests who will be able to speak from their experiences, either working in the federal policy space or as a young person who's been advocating for student rights in education and ensuring that all students have access to a quality education. I want to make sure that everyone is clear that we have closed captioning provided. I want to invite audience members to share their questions using the Q&A function, not the chat function, but use the Q&A, and we will get to them towards the end. But again, you will be able to have access to closed captioning if you need it. And also, if you hear something that resonates with you, use the Student Voice in Policy hashtag. That's hashtag Student Voice in Policy. My Twitter handle is @EdToBeFree. If I say anything to step on your toes, it's so you stand up straight on behalf of our young people. Honestly, I'm not really worried about whether or not your feelings are hurt if it means that you hear something that's important for providing a quality education. If you will allow me, I will also provide a land acknowledgement for the Lenape people whose land I was born on in Brooklyn, New York with the Canarsie tribe. And I currently live on Lenape land, unceded land and territory in Baltimore, Maryland, where the Susquehanna tribe was founded and were stewards of this land. So thank you again for joining us. We're gonna dive right into our panel. Want to make sure that you all have access to a new paper we released today in partnership with Student Voice. So hashtag StuVoice. This is a partner organization we've been working with to make sure we do our own due diligence at Center for American Progress to make space for and get out of the way of young people whose voices are critical in the education policy space. So you will find a link to that new piece in the chat. And we hope that you engage with it and make it a part of your own practice. I am going to now pivot to the panel. We prioritized using community-informed policymaking. There are no excuses for us being in the DC bubble to not engage people with lived experiences, and this panel is a piece of that. I'm going to pivot to our panel and ask them to just give us a couple of minutes about the work that they do, in addition to why they think it's so critical for students to have a voice in federal policymaking. Sadie, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Sadie Bograd. I am a rising first-year student at Yale, and I just graduated from high school in Lexington, Kentucky, where I am now, and I use she, her pronouns. I've been involved in student activism in one way or another, mostly at the local and state level, since around middle school. More specifically, I'm a member of the Kentucky Student Voice Team, which is an independent nonprofit that supports students as research advocacy and policy partners to improve Kentucky schools. And as post-secondary projects manager of the Kentucky Student Voice Team, I helped work on our legislative advocacy around need-based state scholarships, as well as our research into the barriers to post-secondary access and success in Kentucky. And then more recently, I was a quantitative lead on our Coping with COVID student-to-student research project. In spring of 2020, in partnership with local professors, we launched a statewide survey which garnered nearly 10,000 responses about students' experiences during the pandemic. And over the past year, we've been using that data to analyze it, draw conclusions, and create legislative recommendations. And then in addition to that, I've long been interested in student journalism and really the power of students as storytellers, which I think is intimately connected to the topic we're discussing today. And so in addition to some freelance journalism and being editor-in-chief of my school's newspaper, I am a former Student Voice Journalism Fellow and a current member of the Student Voice Press Corps. As you all already heard, Student Voice is a national nonprofit dedicated to improving students' role in education policymaking and combating educational inequity. And so as a member of the press corps, I write stories about students' experiences and opinions and activism. And that's really what brought me to this panel today, since I am one of the co-authors of this issue brief that just came out as a complement to this event about how students can help build better education policy. And with that, I'll pass it back to Kalila. I just wanted to say thank you all so much for having me here, and I'm excited to speak with all of you.
Thank you, Sadie. And I should also share that I use she, her pronouns. We are going to go to, is it Ian? I want to make sure that I am saying your name correctly.
Yeah, it's all right. It's Ian.
Ian. Okay.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Ian Salvosa. I also use she, her pronouns, and I'm a student advocate from Lake St. Louis, Missouri. I'm a recent high school grad, and throughout my senior year of high school, I just became immersed in education justice because I really saw my school community struggle with COVID-19. It didn't really take too long to realize that student perspectives were not being prioritized in our adaptations to the pandemic. And in preparation for the 2020-2021 school year, a survey was sent out to our school teachers and parents, but none were sent out to students. And this was just one of many occurrences where students were just put on the back burner and not prioritized in the adaptations. And it ultimately pushed me to lead a few student organized initiatives in order to increase student representation in my district. Due to the lack of student surveys, I engineered one myself that allowed students to record their comfort levels with in-person, virtual, and hybrid learning, and also provide feedback for our Board of Education. There was this obvious disconnect between students and our Board of Education, so I wanted to organize our first ever Board of Education candidate town hall. That way we just have the chance to learn about our decision makers and our representatives. And lastly, like Sadie, I'm a student journalist myself. I was an editor-in-chief of my school paper, and I developed a beat on our Board of Education meetings just so we can stay updated on education news. On the federal level, this past year, I was an organizing fellow with Student Voice, and as an advocate, I became involved with their Start with Students campaign, aimed towards ensuring student voices are prioritized in the Biden-Harris administration. Through listening sessions and drafting sessions, we joined forces with over 1,500 students, and we were able to create the roadmap to authentically engage youth voice in the U.S. Department of Education. And lastly, as an incoming first year at the George Washington University, I am so ready to continue bridging that gap between students and policymakers. And I'm ready to share my thoughts with the state of that relationship with you all today. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Ian. I'll say to both you and Sadie, I've been doing work in my own local school district to make sure that student members of our board have full voting rights. Sometimes we have students who are welcome to spaces, but they are not actually taken seriously. Excuse me, and their voices aren't valued. So really appreciate you pushing in this way. Excuse me, I'm gonna go to Mark now. Mark, will you share?
If I can get off mute. Thank you, Kalila. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm Mark Washington. I'm a Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education at the U.S. Department of Education. And I see that we made the brief, so thank you. I'm looking forward to diving in and talking more about just the perspectives. Prior to this position, also worked as the Performance Improvement Officer, and also worked long before that in federal student aid. And so I've had at the Department of Education a number of opportunities to see how we incorporate the student voice. And I agree with both Sadie and Ian said that it's so easy to disregard or just not include the student voice. And, it doesn't make any sense when we do that because almost every decision that we make is about students. So looking forward to more of this discussion, and thank you again for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you, Mark. Cheri, I'm going to pitch to you now.
Thanks, Kalila, and thanks to the Center for American Progress for putting on this event on this really, really key topic. I'm really honored to be here with leaders like Sadie and Ian, who are doing this work, and also with colleagues like Mark. So I'm Cheri Hoffman. I'm the Director of the Children and Youth Policy Division at the Department of Health and Human Services. And part of my role at that job is also leading a federal interagency working group on youth programs, which has been around since about 2008, and really is focused on coordinating and collaborating across any federal agencies that have youth-serving programs. So we have over 21 federal agencies and departments that are partners with us in this work. And the working group itself takes a positive youth development approach to young people. That's something that I've been passionate about through my career, which started in local community-based organizations, working with young people and mentoring roles and lots of different ways that eventually led me to a policy career, wanting to really make an impact on these issues at this level. And that career started with 5 years on Capitol Hill, where I was a legislative director for a congresswoman, and then really was excited to find this role at the Department of Health and Human Services that lets me work on youth serving programs across the country. So our hope with the working group is that we take every agency in their thinking about youth engagement from wherever they are to one step further along the line, right? Different agencies are at different places in how they understand the importance of youth engagement and what youth engagement really means, not just reaching people with programs, but having young people's voices at the table and being involved in decision making. And so we hope to improve everybody's understanding of that a little bit across the government. So we'll have a chance to talk a little bit more about what that looks like right now. So thank you, and I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks so much. You know, I want to give a shout out to Ashley Jeffrey, who's one of the co-authors, and she's no longer on our team at CAP. She's gone on to do bigger and better things because she's working directly with young people. I'm a little jealous. Big difference between being in policymaking and actually being in a schoolhouse watching the growth and development of young people every day. It's one of my most rewarding experiences beyond being a mom. And I can't tell you how critical it is to listen to people who have lived experiences that are relevant in real time. That's why we do our community conversations. We've done a couple of them with young people from across the country, just to do a gut check for ourselves. You know, we're in rooms with federal policymakers, state level, local level all the time. Are we even saying the things that you want to have happen? Are we saying things that connect to the experiences you have? And as a critical race theorist, the actual meaning of critical race theory, I prioritize making sure people can share their own voices directly instead of having it filtered through any research that I'm doing. There's no greater qualitative or quantitative tool for that matter than hearing people's voices directly. So just wanted to give Ashley a shout out on this great piece that was released today. And I want to pivot back to you, Ian, and ask a question about any meaningful ways that you've seen in your own advocacy, in your work with Student Voice, or even now as you've launched into college, where people have gotten it right in terms of involving young people and students in a policymaking space.
Yeah, for sure. So I think that two really meaningful examples of student involvement are just youth advisory councils and focus groups. And I think these are great ways to involve students because you're having that direct conversation with them, kind of like this, where people from all different backgrounds, all across the country, just having a conversation, a direct conversation. Because if you create safe, comfortable spaces like that, then students are really given the opportunity to come forward about their issues. And we need to involve all students in this process. There is quite a bit of an issue with this type of student involvement, though. And I kind of look at it as student involvement from the outside in. Students are kind of still kept on the outside. They're in this focus group, but they're just kind of pitching their ideas. They're just kind of casting a line and maybe hoping that they'll come up with something. But we need to start including students with partnerships with adults. And I think a great example of this with Student Voice was with the Start With Students campaign. We hosted, I believe, 4 different listening sessions with hundreds of students across the nation. And we just had really awesome, meaningful conversations about financial inequities in our school, what it's like to be a student of color in our schools today, how our schools reacted to COVID. And it just, even myself, like it just opened me up to so many different perspectives that I had never known about before. And I want to call attention to one of the key youth voice terms that we highlighted in the roadmap to authentically engage youth voice, which is co-creation. Co-creation. And what that means is having students and adults at the same table, having that conversation and creating policy together, and not having students only going in from the outside in.
Thanks, Ian. As someone who actively participates in grassroots organizing, you can't be at the grassroots, which is the anchor of policy, and just function at the grass tops. So in my personal life, I definitely continue to engage in grassroots organizing. As I said, currently right now, that's focused on getting student members of our Board of Education to have full voting rights. And something you said about that co-creation concept is the idea that policy, it does not have to be a reactive situation. We should start with people who are experiencing the context of the policies that we're creating, and not just invite people in at the tail end to inform us or give us ideas about what we've come up with. So thank you for sharing that, Ian. Sadie, I want to pitch to you as well. Have you seen some meaningful or compelling strategies that have been used to engage students in policymaking? And if you have an example at the federal space, that would be great as well.
Yeah, I mean, I really want to build on what Ian was saying. I think there's sort of a tension between co-creation, having students and adults working in the same space on the same issues, generating new ideas, and a tension between that and tokenizing students. I think sometimes there's this perspective that if we want to bring a student into an adult space, we're only going to bring in 1 or 2 students. And that often ends up having those students being asked to represent the entirety of students, which obviously is impossible to do. But at the same time, if you're only having, 1 roundtable or 1 focus group with a bunch of students and 1 adult, and those students are never meaningfully brought into the co-creation process, then that too can be tokenizing in its own way, and that students are asked to sort of share their experiences, but not participate in the end result of that process and build the policies. So I do think there are a couple sort of prominent examples from the local all the way to the international level of student voice gone right, or at least gone better than it usually does. One thing I want to point out, sort of from my own experience, is in Kentucky for years, there have been a whole bunch of different student groups on the outside sort of pushing to be involved in policymaking conversations. I know the Kentucky Student Voice team particularly has worked on everything from need-based scholarships to mental health counselors in schools, all sorts of different issues. And I think as a result of all of that state and national pressure from the outside, there have been some sort of internal institutional changes. So in 2018, the school safety working group that the state government created included a full student member on that working group, and they had a full role in all of the recommendations and outcomes of that. And then even more recently, a student and teacher non-voting member were added to the State Board of Education. So these are both examples of students being brought in to actively consult on the policymaking process. But then again, it is 1 student and there is still more work to be done. But I think this really highlights how it's important to have both students on the outside engaged in activism, pushing for their priorities, and at the same time have students on the inside sort of collaborating with pre-existing systems so that they can play a consistent and meaningful role in policymaking. And I know in the issue brief, we highlight a lot of examples at both the federal and international level where that's gone well. For example, in Australia, they have a student representative council whose members sit on advisory groups throughout the Department of Education and even meet with the Minister for Education on a regular basis. And then many other federal departments, including FEMA, Housing and Urban Development, have all worked to create various kinds of youth advisory councils or programs that really bring in large groups of students so that multiple different students from multiple different backgrounds can contribute. Of course, there are always issues here. How are these students selected? Are we engaging students from all different backgrounds, and especially engaging students who are traditionally marginalized in these conversations? There are still open questions there, but these are some great examples.
Thank you, Sadie, for lifting that point also. And, as a former school leader, people always were jarred when I would say, is there someone who's been punished today because they were doing something they shouldn't be? And that would be the student I would grab whenever we would have visitors, because A, they were typically the most interesting to lead a tour of the school, and B, if you aren't able to talk with someone about what their challenges are and look at things through their perspectives, you're always going to have short-sighted policy. You're always going to have short-sighted experiences, because the goal is to make sure that every child has access to a quality education. So inevitably, sometimes my teachers would be like, I don't think you should do that, Ms. Harris. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's the best person to lead this tour. And inevitably, you have a young person who's moving through the school hall and might be saying to other friends, like, get out the hallway because I'm leading a tour. It would be like, that would be more impactful than me trying to do this fake, let's clear the halls and make sure everything's hunky-dory. So, there are multiple ways to look at that. And whenever we're doing community informed policymaking, to your point, Sadie, it is always a challenge if you only talk to one group of people, because typically that group of people likely were more accessible to you because they have networks that other folk don't have. And so it's critical for us when we do this process that we don't just have a single conversation, you repeat the conversation, you go back to communities and talk to someone else from the community who may not respect the people you spoke to the last time for whatever reason. You don't know what the issues are on the ground. And when it comes to the schoolhouse or your local community, only picking students who are in student government or on your student congress or, and not talking to students who might have been formerly incarcerated, students who may be unhoused, students who are foster youth, students who are new Americans, all of these things, students with disabilities, multiple students with disabilities, because no disability is the same. It's important for us to make sure that we aren't tokenizing any one type of student and using it as evidence that we have done what we're supposed to do, because inevitably we're going to miss lots of people. So, Mark, I want to pitch to you to talk about work that you've done and examples that you have from effectively engaging young people in the federal space.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I know you want me to talk about the federal space. I'll just say that I'm impressed with just what has been discussed so far. And I worked in Brooklyn, New York in a nonprofit association that was really about youth services and housing alternatives, particularly for families and people who have been either incarcerated, homeless, or drug addicted. And what I found there was that we did good work, but just to Ian's point about tokenism and what Sadie was saying earlier about and Sadie said something about tokenism as well, like there is a difference between so-called inclusion, I'll put in air quotes, where the agenda is already set and you can't really influence it, right? There is power in perspective. And to the point that you made, Kalila, like if people can't really give it, if you're not talking to a number of different voices and people that are impacted or who want to bring impact to a particular topic, then you can glad hand a lot of people and a lot of conversations doing the right things and checking the boxes. And so right after that experience, I went to a 4-year liberal arts college or university, and I was the financial aid director. And I had a part in trying to help make certain that we had student presence on the school board. And that was a feat. And we got the student representatives, and I said, no, that's not enough. Like, they need to be able to vote. They don't need to just be there to be acknowledged. They need to be able to vote. They need to vote like everyone else. And so there is a difference between, again, just the point of tokenism, between representation, right, but then actual partnership that allows for the perspective to be placed in policy. At the federal level, I was actually surprised. So I came in to the Department of Education, and I've been there a long time, but I came in doing fiscal policy. And one of the first things that struck me was that we had negotiated rulemaking. This was in federal student aid. And at the time, we were still very actively involved in the higher ed rulemaking. And I looked around the table and I saw members from the press, of course, members from public interest groups, and members from student associations like the National Student Government Associations, which I realize can kind of be, you can view them as a canned organization, but there were others. There were students around involved in the negotiations. And they literally had a place where they could raise concerns that would stop us from negotiating, and we had to go caucus. And I thought, wow, that's incredible. Also, I worked for the first chief operating officer of federal student aid, and his first hire was to hire a student director. And he is the first person to actually start a critical but a viable student internship program. And I saw in the report that one of the areas that I think Sadie and Ashley thought that we could do better at the Department of Education is around internships. And we still do them. But I would agree with that point. I think that it's always important to have student voices around. What I've seen work well with the internships that we've had is that we actually try to integrate students in the work. There are federal rules about what we can give them to do and not, but certainly in the conversations, in the perspective seeking, up to the level of the Secretary of Education, I've been at a table where students are asked, like, directly, what do you think? Do you think this policy could work? Or better, what is the policy that you think needs to be considered to remedy the particular, issue or topic at hand? So I've seen that work well in education. Certainly there's more room to do better. But I think that in everything that we do, students have always made it better. Students have forced us to look at ourselves and really figure out, are we being serious right now? Or are we being representative just for the sake of checking a box?
Thank you, Mark. And I will plus one the internship piece, but plus one it with pay. You immediately exclude large swaths of the general public and of young people if they can't afford to come to the District of Columbia to live, to work, to advise. And I would add there that when we think about budgeting for any student engagement at the federal level, there has to be pay associated with it, and there has to be a mechanism to support with housing. You have students who live across state lines in Virginia and Maryland who can't afford to come to DC.
You're absolutely right.
Can't afford the mark just to come in and out every day. So.
And I'll say, I'm sorry, I don't want to go over my time, but I'll say what made that internship special was that people did get paid. So the students got paid, they got transit benefits. We helped them find housing at local universities that were basically allowing their dormitories to be used. So we used GW a lot at the time and Catholic. And, we really had a program set around trying to have a serious student internship program and perspective and experience so that they didn't have to combat with how am I going to afford to live, or do I have to do something else at night because I'm sitting around the table with the secretary during the day, and I'm waiting tables at night. We didn't want that. And I think you're absolutely right that you have to have those supports there.
That's great. And that's advisable for other departments. When I was at the Department of Education in the Obama administration, our interns were not paid. And so inevitably you had students who are affluent, and we have some of the questions in the Q&A box about, typically affluent young people who are connected, being representatives for student voice when they're not actually representative of the general population. And, I think across the federal government and including the executive branch and on the Hill, it's important that young people are paid for internships. They should be paid in corporate America too, let me just say. Interns are not, the experience of volunteering certainly is valuable, but pay people for their work. And I love the caucus notion that you raised as well, that is a good way when people are in the room. If you really mean that they have a voice in the situation, there should be a caucus mechanism so that it's not just like, okay, we've heard you, now we're going to decide. So thank you for that. Cheri, I want to bring you in as well to share similarly on meaningful experiences that you've seen.
Yeah, I think I can speak to a couple of levels of things. I think Sadie and Ian have raised a number of the challenges that we face in doing authentic youth engagement, particularly at the federal level, but there certainly are good examples of that. And the word tokenism is one that really keeps me up at night. It's sort of my biggest fear that in this work that we've been doing to engage young people that it would stop at that tokenism level, right? But I also think it's important for us to encourage if you know what Hart's ladder is, and the Hart's ladder of youth engagement has a number of different rungs leading up to, right, the highest level being real interaction at policymaking and decision-making levels. Tokenism is the lowest rung of the ladder, but it's above the floor, right? And so if somebody's doing nothing, we'll take them to tokenism, and then we'll convince them to move further from tokenism all the way up the rungs of the ladder. And so I'll tell you about the efforts of the Interagency Working Group on Youth Programs as a whole. Where we've started is having a youth editorial board, right? As Mark said, there are lots of federal rules around how we can engage different people. And if you have an advisory board and it's called an advisory board, there's actually a law that tells you how you have to do that. And that law turns out to be expensive to implement. And so being an organization that doesn't have any funding attached to it, we have called our group a youth editorial board. And their role really is to co-create that content that is on our websites. The main website being engage.youth.gov, which is directly intended for young people themselves, and is a sub website of youth.gov, which is aimed at adults who work with youth, providing kind of one-stop shop of federal information about young people and any federal resources that are available. So our Youth Engaged for Change is what we call the engage.youth.gov website, and the editorial board is made up of anywhere from 8 to 12 young people. They're as diverse as a group of 8 to 12 young people can be. This gets right at the issue of how can we ask that small of a number of young people to represent everybody across the country. At the same time, functionally being able to manage a group larger than that is very difficult with the resources that we have. So we do our best to recruit a diverse group, and that means geographically, that means race and ethnicity, that means lived experience in some of these federal systems that have been mentioned, criminal justice, juvenile justice systems, foster care. We have young people with disabilities there. So we do our best to do that, and then also offer other opportunities for bringing in other youth voice, using social media, using contests, using listening sessions, all of those different kinds of mechanisms. And they really do, young people challenge us in the best of ways, and they give us new insight and bring perspective and voice and experience to the table that we just don't have. So that youth editorial board has been going for a couple of years now. We'll be ready to start a new round of recruitment soon for young people to be part of that. And then there are other ways across federal agencies, speaking to internships and the work experiences that folks have mentioned. We use, there's a program called the Virtual Student Federal Service, which is operated out of the State Department. It used to be the Virtual Student Foreign Service, and now that it's been opened up to all federal agencies, they call it the Federal Service instead of Foreign Service. But that's one way to equalize opportunities, right? That anybody can apply to be an intern in that program, and you don't have to have the capacity or the privilege to be able to move to Washington, D.C. to be able to do an internship in a federal agency, right? So it's an equalizing opportunity. That program is not paid at this point, to your point, Kalila, that those are some improvements that can be made in that way. We do offer honorariums for the young people that are on our editorial board for Youth Engaged for Change. We pay those out quarterly over the course of the year. Not ideal, but we don't have a mechanism that would allow us to pay folks as staff at the moment. There are some federal agencies that have figured this out better than others. The Children's Bureau, which runs all of the federal foster care programs across the country, they have something called Young Adult Consultants, YACs. And those are young people with lived experience in the foster care system who are hired and who work with the contracting groups, the contracting companies that the federal government uses to do a lot of their work. And they are staff like any other federal staff would be who is hired directly into the agency. They're reviewing grant applications, they're working on regulations, they're doing all of the work of a federal staff person. And I think that program in particular is one that we highlight often because we think that's really at the higher levels. That's really getting to the policymaking piece rather than just thinking about some of the products that are coming out of the federal government. And yeah, we are continually working, we're continually having interns come into our office in HHS. different ways that we have to do that. There are mechanisms. The Pathways program can bring in interns, and folks can get hired into the federal government through that program. The Presidential Management Fellowships bring, new master's level graduates into the federal government. Always looking for new ways to do that and make sure that those folks are paid and compensated. And even in our research projects that we do, we have pushed to make sure that young people are considered experts in the same way that someone who's been, an academic researcher at a university for many years, who would get an honorarium to come and give their expert advice. Young people should get the same kind of honorarium. And at times we will pay young people and not pay other experts, because young people are more likely to be doing this kind of work, giving us this kind of expertise and insight outside of their jobs, right? They're probably going to have to take time off from work, or they're probably going to have to switch their schedule or do something different, whereas another expert would be doing this considered as part of their job and already getting paid for it, and so not really need the honorarium. So in those cases, we will prioritize honorariums to young people over the other adult experts that are there. So I think there are a number of strategies that are working. Several federal agencies will do different kinds of youth boards, where they may bring young people on for a year to take on a particular project in, partnership with an adult, and that's sort of the whole experience. We can do better at bringing them in at the policymaking level, but that's where we still really need to focus the work, I think.
Thank you, Cheri. I want to just take a pause for another commercial to say that we are definitely pulling in questions from the Q&A. So if you have a question, please do drop it in the Q&A box. Also want to amplify that tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the We Build EDU campaign will be hosting a town hall sharing results from educators of color about their experiences during COVID-19. About their experiences with intensified calls for racial justice, and with their perspectives on how we reimagine public education so it works for all young people. And it is also a part of our community-informed policymaking process. So having young people share their voices today during this session, and then tonight, the We Build EDU Town Hall, which is in advance of EduColor's National Summit taking place tomorrow. We would love for you to join us, hear that information. And again, that campaign is also something that we've done to make sure we hear from the voices of people who are not normally asked how their experiences are undertaken and how policies are impacting them. For the sake of the We Build EDU campaign, educators are any adult who interacts with a young person from the time they leave home until the time they return home. That could be the bus driver, that could be the office manager, custodial team, cafeteria team, of course, teachers and school leaders, school counselors, paraprofessionals, whomever that was, as long as they were an educator of color, participated in that national poll. We got almost 2,200 respondents to talk about their experiences. So please do join us tonight. I want to pivot back to you, Cheri, though, and talk about adults. Adults can serve as a real barrier to student engagement. There are a number of school districts that have no students on their boards of education. But I want to ask you, and then I'll pivot to you, Mark. What tools, what strategies have you used to encourage and impress upon other adults and colleagues to not pat young people on the head or pat students on the head and make their involvement superficial, instead of having them be a group that can caucus, that can stop negotiation or stop participation to ensure that their perspectives are being brought to the table and taken seriously?
Yeah, thank you. I say every time we're having an event that both young people and adults are going to be at, I'm always more worried about what the adults are going to do or going to say that causes a problem than I am about the perspectives that the young people bring. It's really challenging. It takes a lot of education. And right, sometimes I am so immersed in this world where myself and the people that I work with and the people that are part of our working group get it and understand what youth engagement means and how important it is. That I forget that we are maybe still a minority. I hope the numbers are increasing in terms of, how many folks across the government believe in the importance of this. And so sometimes you run into a brick wall, right? Like we had a convening about youth engagement strategies and how we should be doing this across the government. And we put that into the clearance process, which is always dramatic in the federal government about who has to sign off on what can be said. And we ran into a roadblock very fast from people who were close enough to me in my role that I should have known better, that I had to do more education with them about what we meant by youth engagement. It was a foreign concept, and it was like, what do you mean that I could be at the same table with some, a young person who would have the same exact power as I was? It was a real reminder of the kind of dynamic that we're working with and the kind of historical discrimination really that's been in these systems towards the thoughts and the value of young people being in these conversations. So, right, events like this, conversations like this, opportunities to showcase what has happened successfully across different federal agencies. That's why I talk about the Children's Bureau Young Adult Consultant Program every single time I can, because that is a successful model, and it, you can see what the results of it have been, and it can be replicated in other agencies and done in other places. And, not being afraid to speak truth to power and call it out when you see it, and say, young people clearly have the expertise that we need here. And, for us in the federal government, things change as leadership changes in terms of where people are. But those of us like Mark and I who have been here for a while and will probably be here for a while, we get to keep sort of carrying that message forward and figuring out, how to say it a little differently or tweak it a little differently each time to get through to the folks that it needs to get through to. So it does take some time. It is a big hurdle, but continuing to have great examples of where it's happening and people really get it right. Like exposure to the idea is so often the first step in changing people's minds. It's something that they haven't seen before. If they haven't seen it, they don't know how it can work. And right, I think anybody who listens to Sadie or Ian, talk about their experience is going to be educated about what this really can mean. And so we need more of these opportunities.
Thank you. Tell me about it. I mean, one of the biggest pushbacks against our student board members having full voting rights is, what if they know the people involved in the personnel decisions? I'm like, what if the adults know the people involved? Are you making an assumption that the young people are going to somehow be biased and unable to be professional when the adults, we call Baltimore Smaltimore. We have biases and need to recuse ourselves from time to time. But Mark, how about you? What steps have you taken to make sure other adults are being checked and opening the door for belonging of students?
I'll just say to start, I like what Cheri said. There's a lot of truth there, and I tried to do some of the same things. I have tried to integrate our interns or young people who want to learn more about what we do, learn more about government, when they're there, to integrate them into what we do. So for instance, I will not allow any of my interns to call themselves just an intern. I know that seems like a small thing, but I won't do it. Like that, to me, that just kind of undermines them. I don't do that. I involve them in meetings. I will send them to meetings. I think about one of the best interns I ever had, who's right now running a major piece in the General Services Administration, GSA. He had incredible graphic gifts, writing gifts. He was so smart. And he started out with, I'm just an intern, I can't go to that meeting. None of that, So one is how we treat them. Two is who we bring in. So where I am now, I had an interest in getting more kids of color into some of these programs. And just what you said, Kalila, like, an issue often is income, housing, things like that. And so I was able to pair up with a couple of colleagues who knew of programs like the Truman Foundation programs that actually take care of the housing and give a stipend. We started there. I'm interested now. I have a colleague who is over our Indian education programs, and he's out of New Mexico now. We want to develop something for Native American, Native Alaskan students who never have these opportunities. But again, we've got to find some funding for them. And then, frankly, I live in Southeast DC. I live in an area where I see young people all the time thriving. I'm personally involved in youth programs, always have been. Throughout my career, I am now. I work with boys in DC public schools. And so I'm constantly trying to figure out, how do we expose them to what we do? And how do I bring some of my colleagues into where they are? So just in the last administration, I was able to get the secretary to come into around the corner from me and a few other schools where no one ever comes. I live in Ward 8 in Washington, D.C., and there's just not a lot of love in Ward 8. There's a lot of great things. There's a lot of promise and opportunity springing up. And this is a beautiful, natural area of the city and of the region. But that's not what you hear when you're listening to the news, right? And that's not what you see. And so I've tried to do some kinds of two-way sorts of exposure. I think programs like My Brother's Keeper, which really formalize a lot of the opportunities for inclusion and consultation, actually helped us as well. That secretary then was Arnie Duncan, and then John King. They very much were open to the notion that, we need to get out more. I'll say Betsy DeVos in the last administration also was as well. I mean, she was a secretary that I brought over here to Ward 8 to see there are bright kids here that just need opportunities and exposure. So that's one way I try to do it. The last thing I'll say is that the rescue packages that this president has put out, the last president, trying to deal with the pandemic, obviously it's a lot of money, and I work in a unit that's responsible for getting that money out. And this last recovery package, the American Rescue Plan, Congress put actually consultation requirements in that package, which was great, because along with making states come up with plans to be able to get all of the money, so we gave the first 2/3 of the money out. The last 1/3 we held back, and we asked people to give us plans for how they actually would address some of the issues that have been raised in the pandemic. And one of the things they have to do is show that they are consulting with several groups, amongst them student groups. And so for some states, that probably wasn't that easy, or not something that they may have necessarily done if that requirement was not there. But whether it's easy or not, we have an obligation to make certain that the people that we're trying to serve actually feel served and actually can speak to what service ought to look like to help them. So those are just some small ways that we've tried within the department that I've tried to be involved in.
That's awesome. Thank you for that. It's to your point, even with the last administration, good, bad, or indifferent, that anybody is willing to leave the high castle and go to where people actually live and work is critical to, even if it was just planting a seed to shift how they think about the American public and the people who don't have the luxuries and privileges that they do. So I think that's awesome. The rest of this time, we're going to primarily spend with Ian and Sadie, just to make sure we are giving space for them to answer some of these questions and just share their own experiences. And one of those, and let me also say, the link for the We Build EDU town hall tonight as a pre-summit is in the chat box. So anyone can scroll up there to find it. And we will post it again at the end of the event. But Sadie, you're a co-author on this piece. I see several questions about how students who don't have Board of Education or opportunity to serve on their Board of Education, where do they begin with advocacy? Both you and Ian have talked about seeing challenges and making a decision to get involved. Where do young people begin? Where do adult allies begin to make sure that they have access at the local level that they can then translate up to federal policymaking?
Yeah, I think there are a couple things I want to mention. First, I really liked what Mark was saying about sort of this tendency of students to be deferential when they're brought into adult spaces. There's this expectation of, oh, I'm just an intern. Oh, I know I only have lived experience, and so maybe that doesn't count for as much. And so I think one thing that is critical for both students and adults is to really engage in this co-creation and co-learning process, doing whatever you can in policy and tone and practice to ensure that students are seen as full partners in the work and the advocacy that they're doing, and not just sort of brought in occasionally. And one thing I want to add on to that is this idea of starting young. I mean, I think a lot of internship programs are geared towards post-secondary students, maybe high school seniors. And it really is possible to bring students in, especially at a local level, when they're in middle school, even in elementary school. At the local level, I've seen individual schools create their own student voice teams for younger students. And that's a great way to bring in students who may be completely unfamiliar with this idea of student voice, or maybe new to this idea that their perspectives are valued in the classroom. So I do think this element of starting young, bringing in students at the school and even the classroom level can really help transform how students view their own capacity and their own power to make a difference, and also ensure that adults at all levels are really committed to the work and committed to valuing student perspectives, regardless of age or background.
Thank you. I also wanted to plus one mark on that. When I had students, I would, if they told me what career they want, that was it for the rest of their academic career. If you say you want to be a doctor, you're Dr. such and such. And other people would be like, Dr. such and such. I'm like, that's what they're going to be. That's it, the end. And my students could tell you, or former students could tell you, I never believe in that concept of future leaders of tomorrow. It's like, what are we waiting for? If we don't get it right now, we may not get to that point for you to be someone who has a title of some sort. You lead from the place that you're in. And I always reject young people saying, I'm a future leader. And I'm like, oh, okay, I'll talk to you then, unless you want to talk to me right now. And then they're like, oh, yes, I'm leading right now. It's like, yes, you are. So really appreciate that. Ian, how about you? How would you direct young people who either want to ensure there's a student member of their Board of Education or other places where they can push in to make sure that they have a voice?
Yeah, just for students to ensure that they have a voice in their school district and their state on the federal level, just don't be afraid to reach out to absolutely anybody. I know I personally started, but just by emailing my superintendent, my Board of Education directors. Oftentimes, there's not systems in place where you can directly contact your representatives. And that makes it terrifying. That makes it scary. It makes it seem like, you're just not allowed there. You're not supposed to be there. I know one of the ways that students get involved in my district is through our Board of Education meeting public forums. But oftentimes with these public forums, you're able to have, I believe, 2 or 3 minutes to speak out, let your voice be heard. But there's just these barriers that pop up that don't allow students to attend these things, to sign up. I know in my district, in order to sign up for these public forums, you need to go to the place of the meeting, which is usually like a high school in our district, at 8 a.m. to sign up. And it usually takes place on a school day. So like on Thursdays, 8 a.m., and that's very difficult for students to sign up, because me in the school year, 8 a.m. on a Thursday, I was in math class. Like, that's not feasible for students to go out and to let their voice be heard to their district. And so I think just the biggest thing to really kickstart those conversations is just to reach out, because your representatives, they're there for you. They have their power because of you, because of the students. And I believe on the flip side, it's the responsibility of the adults to make sure that they're creating a comfortable space for their students. I know oftentimes in my school, I live in Missouri and I go to a predominantly white high school. And oftentimes it didn't feel like it was a comfortable place for students of color. And that was a huge part of my identity, is being a student of color. And when it comes to things like curriculum, for example, it's not initially a comfortable space. In my history class, one example is that, my family's from the Philippines, and my history teacher called the Philippines a third world country. And that immediately made it an uncomfortable zone for me. I didn't feel comfortable engaging with the curriculum, engaging with that class, that conversation, because, we were just kind of put on the outskirts. This country, it's third world country, it's just the barrio, it's not seen as a place where your students come from. So adults really need to take that first step in making it comfortable for all their students, because that's actually one of the rights in Student Voices, Student Bill of Rights. We have 9 rights that we believe every student should be guaranteed in schools. And one of those is a positive school climate. And that's really one I really want to stress, in order for students to get engaged with their with their Board of Education, with their state, with the federal level of education, is just making it comfortable for all students to come forward.
Thank you for that. It's interesting because I think sometimes when people want to engage directly impacted voices, they don't take a look at the other things that create I won't go as far as saying hostile environment, but an exclusive environment. And if your content and curriculum, if your other systems are saying to young people, we don't want you here, and then you have this big splash, we're going to have a student member, we're going to have student voice advisory teams, and it's like, yeah, but the content actually erases me and does not look like it wants me here. Those things readily contradict. And I also hear you talking about professional development, ongoing professional development for the adults as allies. I want to pivot a little bit because I thought this question was interesting. They ask about allyship from more affluent young people, what advice you would have for young people who are more affluent, are more connected and well networked, to support making space for their peers and classmates who don't have similar access. How would you advise those folk? And we can stick with you, Ian.
So how more affluent students can become more positive allies for their peers. I think this is a great topic because the high school where I come from, it's kind of a more affluent area. And so kind of like we talked about before, a lot of the student advocates that come about, they're kind of those high achieving students, the ones that are more easily accessible. I think that a great way to reach out to those other students is just, number one, acknowledging that they're there. I think this was stressed particularly during COVID, but whenever we were looking at the different issues when we were in virtual school, we kind of all looked at each other as we're all on the same playing field, but we need to realize that other students, they may not have a properly working laptop at the whole time. They may not have a stable internet connection this whole time. So number one, acknowledging that they're there. And two, just taking into account that these students, they come from other backgrounds as you, and just starting that conversation with them, because like I said before, that positive school climate might not be there. So it's not safe. For some people, it's not safe for them to come forward, and so you need to kickstart that conversation yourself and take the step and make that positive school climate. That way those students can come forward and start that conversation.
Thanks, Ian. And I just saw a question pop up about voice for elementary age children who are living in under-resourced communities. And what I would say is, let's not make an assumption that they don't have voice. Ask them how they lead in their communities. Ask them what they want to lead on in school. And let's not assume that their silence is a result of them not having voice. It could be a result of us not listening. Sadie, you want to jump in on that question as well, for how more affluent young people can be allies to students who have fewer resources?
Yeah, one thing that I think Ian was sort of touching on is that in my experience, adults are often willing to let you join the table, but they're not making an accommodation or reaching out to students who aren't already making that active effort. So I found that many adults, are very impressed that students want to reach out and participate, but they're not taking the time to question which students are reaching out and who's being left out here. And I think it becomes incumbent on the students who are reaching out, regardless of their background, to try to bring other students along with them. Particularly if you're an affluent student, if you're in a gifted and talented program, if you experience some sort of privilege, it's important to think, what experiences do I have that are making adults want to listen to me? What experiences do I not have that other students in my community might be having? And instead of sort of assuming what that experience is like for another student, how can I actually reach out and ensure that those students are at the table? So, if you're scheduling a meeting with your principal or your school board member, saying, I will be here and I will not be the only student here, bringing other students along with you. And especially if you are part of, a student group, thinking about how the institutional dynamics can also be made more accommodating and more accessible for students of all backgrounds is really a key step. I'm aware that we're hitting 3 p.m., but I think just thinking consciously about that, about what your privilege is giving you and who is left out, is really important, and making sure that you are not the only one represented.
That is a powerful word to end on, Sadie. We all have privilege in some way. And it's important for us to bring people along to the table. If you're the only voice or you are edging other people out because you want to be the voice, there is a problem there, and you should always be trying to bring others along with you. So I want to thank you, Sadie. I want to thank you, Ian. I want to thank you, Cheri. I want to thank you, Mark. You were an amazing panel. For those of you who are watching, please join us tonight for the We Build EDU Town Hall with Becky Pringle, who's president of the National Education Association. Frederick Ingram is the treasurer and secretary of the American Federation of Teachers. Christina Setzer is an elementary childhood educator from Sacramento, and Jose Vilson is the founder and executive director of EduColor. We welcome you to join us again tonight. And please, when you get the video, if you registered, please share it with others to make sure Sadie and Ian's voices especially are lifted, but also the resources provided by Mark and Cheri can also be shared. Thanks for joining us, and see us again.